Over the last 10 years, the United States has had an increasing fascination with the economic systems of Nordic countries like Norway and Sweden. And yet, despite the fact that we've had this growing fascination, there haven't been a lot of significant or serious moves in the direction of actually creating the kind of state welfare systems that these countries have. Good morning. My name is Dr. Sean Williams, and I am joining you today with the final session of the 2022 Senior Seminar crew as we examine the social welfare states that are in the Nordic countries. And really the question we're trying to ask is whether or not their systems are something that can be adapted to the United States. I am joined today by four of our absolutely brilliant members of the Senior Seminar class. As they appear on my screen, we have Quibe, Bethany, Savannah, and Carly. Thank you for joining me bright and early on this balmy December day in Campbellsville, Kentucky. How are y'all doing today?
Doing well.
Doing fantastic.
Excellent. I am glad to hear it. So let's get started. First of all, for the people who are listening or who are watching this a little bit later, there are these three kind of big ideological schools, and this might be the hardest question we're going to have today, so I'm going to give it to you, Bethany. There's these kind of three big ideological schools. There's socialism, there's capitalism, and then there's what the Nordic countries actually really identify themselves as social democracies. Can you give a little bit of background to the viewers? What's the difference between capitalism and socialism, and what is this weird hybrid child that the Nordic countries have created?
Sure. So I'm going to do my best. If anybody has anything they'd like to add, definitely open to that. But I'd like to start by kind of explaining capitalism, and that capitalists kind of believe that the government doesn't really use the economic resources as efficiently as private enterprises can do. So therefore, basically, they believe that society is better with the free market. There's economic winners and losers. The government doesn't really hand out as much as some might say in a socialist system. So they're kind of like that. And then socialists believe that the government's responsibility is to reduce income equality through things like social welfare programs and kind of making sure everybody's more at an equal standing point. Social democracy then comes through like a system that has similar values more towards socialism, but they're still within a capitalist framework. They haven't quite gone all the way to socialism. So the ideology named from democracy, where people have a say in government actions, and it supports a competitive economy, more like a capitalist economy, with money, while also helping people whose jobs don't quite support the level of that they can support themselves through capitalism.
So Savannah, excellent job, by the way. Thank you very much. So of these three different ideologies, where do we typically place the Nordic countries, and why do we categorize them that way?
Well, they are in terms of their economy, they are very much capitalist because they do have a free market, because there's very little government interference in terms of, what people are buying. But they definitely do have a lot of social programs that, some people, especially Americans, might regard as socialist, which is where a lot of confusion comes from, because a lot of people think that the Nordic countries are socialist, when really, if you look at how they run their economy, they're very much still capitalist.
What are some examples of programs that, when you look at the Nordic countries, you might classify them as being socialist because of the government involvement?
Definitely their universal healthcare systems.
Okay.
I think one that was... Sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, and also they do have free education for all. So that is something that Americans can also see as strange, because in the US there is a lot of discussion on whether people should pay for college or college should be free. And in these countries, education is free. So
I think another one that's not quite as as stark, but definitely you can tell a difference, In Denmark, they give a full year for both maternity and paternity leave when someone's having a child. In the US, it really only goes up to 12 weeks, and that's, you can kind of use that when you see fit. But they give an entire paid year of leave to both the mother and father who's involved with having the child.
And I think another thing that presents as being very socialist, or what we think is socialist, is that in order to pay for all these things, universal health care, free college tuition, they also pay very high rates of taxes. But I think the difference in those countries is that because the benefits are available to everyone, everyone is willing to make the sacrifice to pay those higher taxes.
And also, another major difference will be the involvement of government in these benefits that Nordic countries citizens benefit from. For example, pay leave, as Bethany mentioned. Here in the US, is more of like organizations have to to decide on whether they should provide what kind of medical benefits for paternity leave. But in these countries, is like there is social laws that dictate those benefits.
But I mean, to listen to you guys describe these differences, I mean, so they have socialized healthcare, but we have a healthcare system, so citizens still get access to healthcare. Theirs is provided by the government. Ours, most people get it through their employer. You're talking about paid. You're talking about maternity leave and paternity leave. Nordic countries provide it. We, by law, employers are required to give their employees paternity or maternity leave. It seems like we do the same things, but we just do them differently. Is that a fair characterization, or am I grossly mischaracterizing? We provide free education to students through the 12th grade. I guess maybe in Sweden they go a little bit further, but then again, most people can get access to free education through community college. It's just structured differently because we provide it with tax rebates rather than paying for it directly with tuition. I mean, are there really that stark of a difference between the United States and Norway for people who live there? Or is this just a distinction without a difference?
Yes. So when I was doing research, one thing that come up to me is like was that in these countries, even though in the US they kind of share, they have some similarities on education systems. Because in the US there's a 2 years college, community college. You can also get a cheap education through those colleges. The same in these countries in Scandinavia. But the problem is that the outcome. So if you want your child to benefit or to get a certain type of education, that's where the disagreement starts. Here in the US, if you are well off, you can send your children to better school, therefore getting a better and outstanding education. But in these countries, it's like public. So if the system is bad or the education provided is not as outstanding, that means even if you are wealthy enough to send your children somewhere else, it kind of beg a question of not getting of the efficacy of the education system. So he lessen choices to parents, whereas in the US, those choices are alive.
Yeah, bouncing off of that, I think that Quibe is making a lot of sense with the way that it works in America. If you have access to a larger income, then you have access to kind of the nicer things that these programs are offering you. So while there is the opportunity for maybe a free education, there's always the opportunity as well for a private institution, which is going to cost more money, or better healthcare is going to cost you more. So even though Americans have access to kind of the same realm of things, the level to which the care is, I think, is a lot different based on how much you can pay for, which might not be the same in those other Nordic countries.
I think another big difference that I found too is that in the US, depending on who's in charge of the government, Democrats, Republicans, things change a lot between different like regimes. So like differences in Medicare, Obamacare, all that kind of thing. But in the Nordic countries, it usually doesn't matter what political side that is in charge of the government at that time, which also I think is probably a cause of most of the countries being parliamentary monarchies anyways, but things don't really change as much there as they do here, which creates like not more, but it creates a lot less problems with being able to access some of these things because they don't change.
Yes.
Go ahead, Klive.
Yes, kind on your point. That's what I did argue in my paper, because these countries have a higher the citizens of these nations have higher trust in their government, and given the fact that, as you stated, things don't change, it's a major factor when you assess how these programs can succeed in the U.S. Because in the U.S., trust in the government among citizens is not as high. So, and these programs really relies on community involvement and also lots of taxes. So, in the U.S., it's gonna be difficult because also, as you point out in your paper, Carly, the population also is another major factor on whether this program could succeed in the U.S.
So looking at those differences, so Carly, you mentioned the fact that they tend to use constitutional monarchies that are parliamentary in nature. You talked about the size of the population. Do you think that the differences between American federalism and the unitary governments in these countries plays a role? I mean, could you make an argument, for example, that part of the reason why we have lower levels of trust in government in the United States is because I have people at the state level always talking about how the national government's bad, and people at the national level always talking about how state government's bad? Does our system contribute to some of this lack of faith or lack of trust or instability in the political system? What do y'all think?
I absolutely think it. Sorry, I think it does absolutely, especially when you've got especially like how we just saw back in the summer, like the abortion law. It was something that was federally guaranteed, and then they gave power back to the states, and now it just causes argument within the states, and then people hate the federal government and the Supreme Court for it. So I think you can definitely make an argument that the way our government is ran and federalism definitely contributes to a lot of mistrust.
Savannah, what do you think? Do you think that federalism plays any role in the problems the United States has with establishing something like the social welfare systems in the Nordic countries?
I think that the main reason why we don't have the social welfare systems like the Nordic countries have is because the US just wasn't really built on that ideology. I mean, there are some people that definitely do want those kinds of programs here, but because because the US was very much built on capitalism, a lot of people, especially conservatives, are against those kinds of welfare programs.
I do think, going back to the question, that federalism does play a big role in that because, like we mentioned, these countries, these Nordic nations, they kind of have a base level, whereas every state can kind of give you different, for example, minimum wage and stuff like that. Every state can kind of change based on whatever the state is doing at the time, and therefore the people who live in those states have a very different experience than people who live in different states. And I think that, and listening to their state government versus the federal government, like the examples Carly was talking about with the unhappiness with the Supreme Court, and when the federal government does give the power to the states, people will be unhappy with the power in the states, and they'll be unhappy if it's federally regulated too. So kind of can't really win in that situation, whereas it's kind of it seems easier to have these programs in these Nordic countries where you don't have to go through states and think about state governments and their courts and stuff like that when you can just have kind of an overall ruling.
So we have the argument that the American people, we tend to like local government. We tend to distrust government. I think a couple of you had mentioned a question about taxes. What approximately is the tax rate in the Nordic countries as compared to the taxation level in the United States, so that they can provide the level of social welfare that they do?
I did a lot of research on this, and it was actually super interesting to me because when we think about it, or when there are people who want to implement more of these social welfare programs in the United States, there's a lot of things that go into it that I don't think are recognized as much. So when I was researching, I did find that the average tax rate in the world is 31.7%, whereas Nordic countries are a lot higher than that, and specifically a lot higher than the United States. So in Denmark, the average tax rate is 55.56%, and then countries like Finland are 51, Iceland 46, Norway 47, and Sweden at 57%, whereas the United States is kind of, I'm not a tax expert, so some of this stuff is a little confusing to me, but it's kind of calculated more in brackets. And then I found that the highest rate, or the highest bracket in 2022, the rate was standing at 37%. And that's for people who are obviously making a significantly more amount of money than the majority of people who live in the United States. So I think that the taxes that are being paid, like someone mentioned earlier, are contributing to things that everyone can appreciate. Where I feel as if in the United States, people a lot of times feel like the taxes they're paying, where are they going, or are they being used for? I hear people talk all the time just in daily conversation like, oh, this is what my taxes are being used for. And you can see that there's a lot of discontent, both in the level that people are paying taxes, the rates that they are paying, and what they're being used for, which I didn't find as much discontent when I was researching about the Nordic countries.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine, and maybe it's because it's, what are you getting, the point that you're making about what am I getting for my taxation? I couldn't imagine in the United States Americans accepting a 55% tax rate, that you go to work and you make $10,000 at the end of the quarter, but then you only take home $5,000 of that, and the rest goes to the government. Like that's hard for me to imagine. Do you think you could see a point where the Americans would accept that kind of a tax burden?
This was really the main takeaway that I had in doing my research, and I don't think that Americans could ever come to an agreement or an acceptance of paying this level of taxes that we're seeing in Nordic countries because of the extremely low takeaways of their checks that would happen. I mean, people are already super unhappy with the levels that they're paying now, and they're even, it gets deeper when you bring into the party divide and everything that goes into that as well. And then again, the different parties that are in control of the presidency and how taxes can fluctuate too. So I personally don't think that we could ever get to a point in this country where people are comfortable giving that much of their money back to the government, especially as we are built on such a capitalistic society. People work for what they make, and they are proud of that. So I think it would take a lot and be a big push to try to get people to agree to be paying this much in taxes.
Yes, I would like to chime in on something that I learned in my international studies classes. Was the difference between collectivism and individualism, and it has appeared to me that Americans tend to be more individualistic, which is something that is not common in Nordic countries. So in the US, it's like you have personal responsibility to make a living, and therefore the government should not dictate how your check to distribute your check and how you should do it with your check. And it's something, it, as Savannah mentioned, that is like one of the core principles that this nation was built upon. And in these countries, Nordic countries, they tend to come together and help each other, and they don't really have a lot of conflict when it comes to taxes and what the government is doing about it. And that is something here in the US is a bigger discussion and a debate, because Americans don't lack the involvement of the government in their lives. So
It's the way that y'all are framing this debate. It's kind of difficult for me to think through, or maybe difficult's not the right word. So I grew up. I guess two different ways of approaching it. I grew up in a Christian community, attended church frequently, and one of the things that was sort of the message that kept being driven home was the fact that as part of being Christian is a sense of taking care of your brother and taking care of your neighbor and taking care of your sister and being part of the community. And the way that you're describing Nordic countries is that they're doing all of these things. They're taking care of their brother, they're taking care of their neighbor, they're taking care of their sister, they're providing for the poor, they're dealing with charity, they're making sure that nobody goes. Why should I not judge this individualism that you're talking about in the United States negatively from that perspective? Or is it that Nordic countries, their culture is superior to ours? Or is it it's just a different way of thinking about the world?
no, so in the US also, they do care about others. The only difference comes to who should be helped, not able-bodied individuals, of course, not. And these two is something that even somebody who was raised in a collective country can have a different perspective on, having my tenure here in the US. So in the US, these are the social programs that exist here only help a particular group of people, including senior citizens, poor single mothers, and also it tend to look the income of citizens, or these people benefit from these programs. Whereas in Nordic countries, they have this principle of universalism. So it doesn't matter how much you pay in taxes, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you get the same benefits as somebody who works, let's say, 20 hours a week, while you spend 50 or 60 hours. Yes, a week. So there is a major difference, because you get what you invest. So I'm not gonna go to work and work 50 hours, earn my living to provide for my family, and pay same taxes, and then my children go to same school as those parents who work 20 hours and also get the same benefits. I should have that option to make sure that my children have a better education.
I kind of can see where he's coming from with this collectivism versus individualism thing. I've also had experiences living in both countries, but I think while the social programs in America are attempting to benefit those who don't have access or who are less fortunate to the things that we have, I don't think that's necessarily not the case in the Nordic countries. I think that these programs are there as a safety net for these people who aren't able to kind of reach the same standard of living as others. But I think this idea of like, who should I help? And I'm putting in more work than my neighbor, and so therefore I want to reap the benefits of what I'm doing more than my neighbor, is kind of, from me, seems like the opposite of what we've been seeing as the benefiting factor or the benefiting motivation, like from these Nordic countries. I don't think that that's their motivation. I think in the US that might be more of like the capitalistic undertones, where like, I'm working for this, so I'm going to use my money, which again goes back to what I was saying about how these systems are not going to be able to be implemented in the US because people who are working for what they want to, or working for their money, want to use that for what they want. I don't know that I'm necessarily in agreement with that, but I think that's the reason why or again, another reason why the United States would be unsuccessful in trying to implement these programs.
Well, and I'd like to say, sorry,
Go ahead.
I think
Go
I'd
ahead.
like to say too, like Bethany and Quive are talking about motivation and how the social programs help the people differently in the countries. But I think that motivation really depends on outlook, and the outlook for both situations of welfare programs are different because the purpose of them are different. So, like Quile was talking about, like the welfare system in the US was built in like the 1930s, between the 1980s, primarily to help like the family unit, poor families, families supporting children with disabilities, single mothers, people like that. But the purpose of the welfare programs in Nordic countries were built after World War II to facilitate adult participation in the job market. So I think that like the purpose on which they're built are different, and so the outlook is different of how we think about it and maybe how they think about it.
Yeah, I think that your point that you're making is interesting for a couple of different reasons. So I said that I had a couple of like philosophical influences growing up. One of them being this idea of Christianity and of Christian love and Christian support. The other one, I grew up as a fan of science fiction. And one of the classic debates in science fiction, at the core of a lot of TV shows like Star Trek and a few others, is what is the human motivation for work? Is the human motivation for work merely an ends to a means that I want to have a good life and therefore I do a job so that I get income? Or is there something very fulfilling about the act of work if you're working within your purpose? So I know what it is that I am, I know who I am, I know what I enjoy, and I try to find an occupation that allows me to do what I love, and therefore I work really hard at it. Do you think that there is any truth to the argument that if given the opportunity to find what they love to do, humans would work hard without monetary reimbursement? Or is it kind of the way that Quibe is suggesting, that the only reason why people work 60 hours a week at a job is so they can provide more stuff for themselves or better opportunities for their kids?
I think that's really interesting, and I think that it would be the first one. And this is kind of funny actually, because I just had this conversation with my dad, who works, I don't know, crazy hours. He works from like 8 a.m. to like 7 p.m. every single day. And I was talking to him about it, and he was like, well, you have to, in his generation, they were taught you have to work hard at everything you do. Don't just put in minimum effort, put in more effort. And I was kind of talking about, why would you put in more effort than you have to if by putting in less effort, you get the same results? So I do think that if given the opportunity, more people nowadays would choose to pursue something that they love and that they enjoy, and they would work harder instead of working harder than they need to at something that is just there to make them money, as long as they had guarantee that they would be getting benefits that they needed to survive.
Well, I'm
find it
sorry, I will
hard.
have to disagree with that, because if we follow that notion, I don't think we will have a lot of advancement in life, especially financially speaking. And that is the reason why there is billionaires, millionaires, and also there is classes. It's not mainly because people live by doing what they love, but they live by doing what is necessary. So it's not all about what you love and enjoy. It's all about what is necessary. And that is why we have a world we live in today. Nobody enjoys being a bricklayer, let's say. But because it's necessary, I think those people find joy in those activities because it has a major impact on society.
Ms. Davis, you had an argument.
I was gonna say something, and then that kind of changed my perspective on some things because it made me start thinking about kind of the jobs that are available under a capitalistic society versus elsewhere. So the jobs that are available for us in the U.S. We live in a capitalist society. You can kind of create your own job. You can find what you like to do and create a business or start a nonprofit or do something that is closer to your heart. And I feel that more people are taking that direction rather than like a government sector job, which seems to be super popular in these Nordic countries. It seems like when I was doing my research, they seemed higher employed by the government than a lot of other countries. I think that people are finding more and more that you can make a means for yourself while also doing something you enjoy. And when you're doing something that you particularly enjoy, not something that you're making yourself enjoy, like Quibe mentioned, when you're doing something that you actually find a purpose in and think that you're good at, I think that that creates the opportunity to be able to be more successful because you're going to be more driven, even if it wasn't driven by monetary needs, which it is because that's just the world that we live in today. Even if it wasn't, I think people would be more likely and more willing to want to share their passion and whatever they're good at, because everybody's better at one thing than somebody else is. Then it would create a really good environment for people to be able to share what they're interested in and what makes them happy, rather than just whatever's going to pay their bill and just force themselves to kind of enjoy this life that they're having to provide for themselves with.
If we do what we enjoy, we'll never have mining workers. If we do what we enjoy, we will never have the freedom that we enjoy today, because nobody will ever want to go and sacrifice his life, because that's not something that somebody enjoys. So I stand by the notion that we must do what is necessary to improve our civilization.
Right. I don't think that anybody believes that we can have a society in which everybody just gets to do whatever they want every day. Like, oh, I want to be a teacher and this person wants to do whatever. I don't think everybody knows that we can't have a society where everyone just does whatever they want. There's obviously jobs that have to be done, but I think where I was coming at and how I interpreted the question is what is going to make people more motivated. And like, he asked, like, do you think that people would work harder for something that they are passionate about and that makes them happy? And I would still have to maintain that I think that is true, rather than just being forced to be in these jobs that, as you stated, like nobody really wants to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So as I'm listening to y'all's arguments and I'm thinking through the differences in these two systems and reflecting a little bit about what's happening in our own society. So in our own society, whenever I was growing up, whenever I was your age or younger, people wanted government jobs because government jobs provided good benefits and stable income, and they wanted to have stability and some kind of security in their life. Nobody wanted to work fast food, and fast food was among the lowest paying jobs in America. And one of the complaints that I'm hearing, especially from the right, is that now we can't find anybody to work fast food because nobody wants to do it. But the result is that now fast food workers are making more and more money. In fact, here at Campbellsville University, I was having a conversation the other day where we are having to pay office workers higher wages because they could just simply go to McDonald's and make more money than what we're paying people to be frontline staff and support. And so I think to Quibe's point, I'm not convinced that Elon Musk is a multi-billionaire because he has to work really hard to provide for his 15 children, as opposed to the fact that simply making lots of money makes him happy, or that making lots of money make Bill Gates happy. And I'm not necessarily convinced that nobody would go into mines, because I think what you'd end up doing is you just have to pay miners a lot more money. But I think people would still probably, be janitors. I just think that we'd have to pay janitors a lot more money than what we do right now if they didn't have to have the job simply to provide basic level standards of living. It's interesting. It's an interesting conversation, I think. But what all of it comes down to is, it sounds like that if the United States was ever to seriously consider moving to the kind of economic system that a Bernie Sanders or an AOC is advocating for, it sounds like we would have to have some significant cultural changes and rethink everything about how our society operates and how we think about work. And to Carly's argument, how we think about supporting other people or taking care of other members of our society. Do you think that those kinds of changes are realistic and possible in the United States? Or do you feel that the system that we have is essentially the system that we're going to have for the rest of your lives and in the lives of the next generation?
I don't see a quick way to making those changes, pushing us towards more of the system like the Nordic countries have. It would be a very long, decades-long process just because of the way our government does work. Like I said, when you have a monarchy and you have a parliamentary monarchy, it's a lot easier to get decisions made, I think. But when we have just so much change and upheaval every 4 years, I don't think that there's a way that you can get our government to agree on being able to go that way, especially when we are just based so much in capitalism. I would argue that big corporate companies almost have as much power over the market and the economy than as the government does.
I would agree with Carly, and I would also say that I feel like the change would have to be so drastic that I don't think that we'll see it anytime soon. Personally, I think I would like to enjoy the benefits that people see in these kind of countries and the way of living, but through my research, I can also see that it's not as easy as just let's implement healthcare or like free healthcare or free college tuition for everybody because of the way that kind of stuff is paid for and implemented. It's much harder than just we want to do this and we want to help everybody, so let's just implement this. My whole thing was about the taxes. So as I went back at looking at the taxes and just the amount of people who are unhappy with the amount they pay already and thinking about having to add to that, I just don't see it happening, especially as our political parties continue to become more and more polarized. I just don't see an agreement or a middle point being able to be reached to where we can implement these programs.
I think.
I'm sorry, Savannah, go ahead.
I think that if we were to have these programs, like the change to it would happen slowly over time, and then each program would just kind of come in one after the other. But right now, I just don't see us having it because so many people are against them because they don't want the higher taxes, and a lot of people think that we're just giving handouts to lazy people.
Yeah. Well, what I would say to this is that a better economy has always have people behind it, and the outcome of an economic with a Nordic approach, I don't think will succeed anywhere where people are more individualistic. So when you look at the United States, not just the population and the people that will have to benefit from these benefits. Let's look about other countries that the United States help. There is a major argument that can emerge to take these type of social economic stands, and everything always looks good on paper, but when you put in practice, that's where you really understand the deal. And I don't think it's a good way to go because we want to build strong people, strong civilization, so that way the next generation can come and enjoy as well. So doing what is necessary is important, so that way we have a good infrastructure and a well function economy.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, especially when we consider. I have a friend of mine who his big passion is AI and the future of robotics and the future of artificial intelligence. And one of the questions that he keeps asking is what happens when we reach a point where all the basic functions that we need to sustain life can be fully automated. And we no longer need somebody to work at McDonald's because McDonald's is fully automated. And we don't need as many janitors because that's fully automated. What happens when we get to a point when these necessities that Klipe is talking about no longer need to be filled by humans? Do the humans who would have filled those jobs just get thrown away by society? Or does society have some mechanism to step in the way that Nordic countries have and provide a way for them to live? It's an interesting question, but unfortunately, that's a question for a different time. So I want to thank all my panelists for joining me. I also want to thank the other members of the senior seminar class who've participated over the course of the semester. And if you have enjoyed this video, go back and check one of the previous discussions from this year or previous years. And until next season, I hope everybody has a good time and God bless.